again, our next speaker, Phillip Yancey, a well-known writer and journalist. Probably most of the people here have read at least one of his books. And we discovered this week that he is also a very good speaker. And it's really a privilege to have him here, and that he accepted our invitation to come to this World Congress of doctors, and dentists, and other professionals. But we may ask why a writer is coming to a doctor's congress. Well, there is a reason is that the link person is Dr. Paul Brand, who was the president of ICMDA for several years, and a very respected doctor and person in our international society. And he was also a good friend of Phillip Yancey, and we guess that he was also his spiritual mentor. So when we mentioned Dr. Paul Brand, Phillip Yancey accepted very quickly to come and be with us. Some of his books, the most known books, are The Jesus I Never Knew, and What Is So Amazing About Grace, and others. And tonight, this morning, he's going to speak to us about serving God and our neighbor with our profession. So we invite.
Well, when I mentioned to my friends where I was going, they also wondered, why are you going to speak to a bunch of doctors? You're not a doctor. And you're right, Dr. Paul Brand has a lot to do with that. He was a great gift to me for almost 10 years. And the other thing you should know is that writers don't really have a life of their own. We don't live, we're leeches. We live off of other people. And Dr. Brand was a great person to attach myself to for about 10 years at a very critical and questioning time in my own faith, and I've been honored to be able to introduce him to others who may not have known him in the same way. Dr. Brand was full of stories. In fact, all of you in the medical profession are, because you touch people at some of the most tender and vulnerable parts of their lives, and I hope you recognize what a treasure trove of stories that you have in the patients, the people that you touch. I have a huge database of every story that I've ever heard from Dr. Brand, and almost all of them made it into one book. But when I was thinking about this conference, I thought, I've got to find a story that I never was able to fit into a book. It was a great story. True story of a patient he treated in India. It was a young man who was in high school, and they had an all-India track meet. And he did the high jump, and actually, in doing this high jump, he set the India record for high school. However, he did not land on the nice cushion part that you're supposed to land on. He landed in the dirt. And he landed on his forearm and had a compound fracture, broke both arms, both bones in his forearm, and it was a mess because it was full of dirt and sawdust and gravel, and his father knew about Dr. Brand's skill as a hand surgeon, so he drove him all day and all night with this open wound to Dr. Brand, and then Dr. Brand found this day-old wound that he had to treat. Now, he knew that the young man, who was a missionary's kid, he knew that the young man named Roger had planned to be a concert pianist, so he knew that it was very important to get the bones in his wrist put back as beautifully as possible. But oh, what a mess. So meticulously had to clean out all the pieces of dirt and sawdust and work on the torn tendons and get the bones aligned just perfectly. Those of you who have operated on hands know how many bones there are and how small they are. And he found that he could do, after hours in the surgical room, he could put everything back together, but this one tiny little bone in the wrist, you medical students probably know which one I'm talking about. It's mostly round, but it has a little point. And Dr. Brand found that he could always put it just in place with his finger, but whenever he removed his finger, it would rotate just a little bit. And for most people, that wouldn't be a problem at all. You would learn to put up with a little bit of pain, discomfort. But Roger had planned to be a concert pianist. And if a pianist is playing Beethoven and starts thinking about the little bone in his wrist, there goes the concert. So he didn't know what to do. I've got to find a way. And then as he's operating, it occurs to him, as long as I keep my finger there, the bone is in place. Aha, got an idea. So he put his finger there and he asked the assistants to do a plaster cast around his finger. And they did. He waited a long time for it to harden. And then very carefully he kind of wriggled his hand out of the glove, which was now surrounded by a plaster cast, poured sterile fluid in it so it would maintain its shape, and he sewed the wound with the broken arm with a plaster cast of a finger sticking out of it. And they had to wait several days, and when they finally went back in and took the plaster cast away, the bone had solidified and stayed in place. Well, years later, Dr. Brand was teaching at the North Carolina Medical School, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And in the middle of his lecture, somebody came up and gave him a piece of paper that said, there's someone here who wants to see you right now, in the middle of your lecture. So he was rather upset, didn't know what to do. He said, okay. And Roger, who is now 20 years older, comes bounding into the room, and he said, I know it's a gathering of doctors, I've got to tell you a story. And he told the story of when he was a high school jumper. And so then Dr. Brand turned to him and said, now Roger, what brings you here to North Carolina? He said, I'm giving a concert tonight. And indeed he did become a concert pianist. Now, I know there are a lot of people, your supporters especially, who feel so sorry for you. They think of the sacrifices that you're going to make, especially those of you who go to other countries and serve in difficult circumstances. I know the truth. I know the truth. That you get to do things that you would never get to do in your home countries. You don't have to, if you go to a place like Dr. Brand was, he didn't have to spend his time filling out bureaucratic forms and insurance forms and work with lawyers and all that. He was actually able to operate on real patients and use his creativity. I love that story because it shows the kind of creativity and freedom that you can have and will have, things that you'll never find in a medical textbook. And those of you who especially go on mission assignments will have those kinds of opportunities. I also love that story because it shows that, as I said to the junior doctors and students a few days ago, you're not treating conditions, you're not treating wounds, you're not treating ailments, you're treating persons. And the true fulfillment that Dr. Brand felt in this story wasn't that he got the bones aligned correctly. It's that Roger was able to fulfill his goal as a person of being a concert pianist. That may be the most important thing that you can learn at this stage. That your patients are not just a collection of cells, that they are indeed persons made in the image of God. In the West particularly, we try to have as little contact with persons as possible. People are inefficient. So that if I try to call my bank, I can never get a real person. I get some recording. If you want this department, punch this number. And if you want this department, punch this number. Or if your computer stops working, try to get a hold of Microsoft. You know, you punch numbers for about 45 minutes, and then if you're lucky, you may get to talk to someone in the Philippines or India, but certainly no one in your country, because that's all outsourced, and people are so inefficient. We don't have time for people. Even in the supermarkets in my country, the goal is to have no people contact, so that we have these self-checkout lines, and you take your groceries and you scan a barcode and the price comes up. And I never have a contact with a real person. In medicine, particularly, you'll find that temptation again and again. People are inefficient, and you'll be tempted in your training particularly to spend as little time with your patients as possible. They're inefficient. You can't make money with patients. You can only make money with insurance companies and government reimbursement facilities. I read a fascinating book that I would recommend to you just recently called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was an uneducated African-American woman who had cancer of the cervix. This is early in the development of cell technology. DNA was just about to be identified. And laboratories around the world were trying to get cells to keep growing. And they would grow for a few generations, and then like all good cells, they would die. Cells have programmed death into them. But for some strange reason, when they took the samples, they took samples from the cancer of the cervix in Henrietta Lacks, they kept multiplying. They never died. They multiplied, and huge factories would produce billions and then trillions of Henrietta Lacks' cells. She had long passed away, but her cells lived on. In fact, all of the cells that were used in the development of the Salk polio vaccine came from Henrietta Lacks. Her cells just kept pumping out and multiplying, and still do today. There are many diseases that were experimented on, that were identified, and the cure was found because of Henrietta Lacks. Her cells were sent up in the first Sputnik, and then the first American spaceships. They used her cells to test the effect of nuclear weapons. So atomic bombs exploded, and then they would go and study Henrietta Lacks' cells. Well, this book tells the story of the scientific history of Henrietta Lacks' cells, and then also tells the story of Henrietta Lacks and her family. This was the 1950s. No one got any informed consent for taking her cells. They just took samples and they started growing. And then there's a quote in there from a woman who did the autopsy. As she was doing the autopsy, she noticed Henrietta, this is the real person, Henrietta Lacks, she noticed her toenails that were covered in kind of a chipped, bright red polish. And she said this, "I nearly fainted. I thought, oh, she's a real person. I started imagining her sitting in her bathroom, painting those toenails. And it hit me for the first time that those cells we've been working with all this time and sending all over the world, they came from a live woman. She was somebody's wife, somebody's mother." Important revelation. We live in a reductionist world. It breaks everything apart. It breaks it down to its smallest constituent parts. And I believe that part of our calling as Christians is to reverse that process, to reassemble the world so that the world is seen as a unified creation of God. So that we can see love for human beings not just as a hardwired evolutionary product that exists just so that we can perpetuate genes with the strange anomaly of altruism that nobody can quite understand, but rather as a reflection of who God is, something of God's image. That we can see justice and ethics in medicine, not merely as arbitrary things that we agree on, social constructs, but rather something expressing God's view of the world, to help restore God's view of the universe, of the planet, of our patients. Medicine bridges the gap between reductionist science and Christian humanities because you do treat human beings, not cells. You know very well that interrelationship, or you will know that what you do with the patient's family can have as much effect on the healing of the patient as any procedure you do in your office. that what you do in inspiring hope and faith in the patient can likewise have as much effect as any medical procedure that you do. The placebo effect has proved that over and over again. You have a great power to help recreate the whole person, to align spirit and soul and body. You can't do that if you treat cells. As I thought about science on the one hand, which all of you are involved in, and faith on the other hand, which all of you are involved in, I realized what different stories they tell about the world. Meta-narratives, as the philosophers say, different stories. Science tells about the world sparking into existence from a 0 point. And then it becomes stardust, the Big Bang, and then it becomes stardust, and then planets form, and then little simple organisms, proteins, amino acids gather together, and ultimately it keeps going toward complexity. So that's the pattern, from nothing, from a 0 point, through an upward struggle, always evolving struggle with many species falling extinct along the way, with a lot of survival techniques going on, much violence. That's the pattern, from nothing, struggling upward, 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 and finally we reach human beings, which are really just an amalgamation of everything that has gone before. The Bible teaches the reverse pattern. The Bible teaches that all of existence begins with a God who is love, who is essence, who is perfection. And it's a downward giving, so that first that God creates space, literally creates space. There was nothing but God, and He created space for something other than God. And you can debate about the different techniques that He used, but they all had the ultimate goal of relationship, of love. Love, God is love. It's a noun, not an adjective. Not a verb. God is love. That is who He is. He cannot be other than love. And all of creation flows out of His love. All of creation is a downward movement, so that after He created Adam, and Adam estranged himself from God, it was God who sought Adam. Adam, where are you? It was God who sought to restore the relationship. When you go back and read the story that the Bible presents, always you see this condescension, God descending to be with. Emmanuel, God with us, to the slaves in Egypt, to Joseph in prison, as we've been hearing, to Daniel's 3 friends in a fiery furnace, to the hostages who were in Babylon, taken from Jerusalem, and finally in the incarnation, the Emmanuel, who took on that name, Emmanuel, one who condescended, descended to be with us, to begin life as a cell, like Henrietta Lacks's the HeLa line of cells. 1 cell, then 2 cells, then 4, then 8, and finally a baby laid in a trough stained with animal drool. That's the condescension. The downward movement, always downward, downward, downward. And that little baby having to learn language like we have to learn language. Studying the verbs, studying the endings on the nouns, studying the Torah with rabbis, learning Aramaic, maybe Hebrew, word by word. That God exposing Himself to everything that we know, to pain and vulnerability, to soft cells, the God who is spirit and had never experienced matter in Himself, had certainly never experienced pain in Himself, and finally death. The downward movement is captured very beautifully by the Apostle Paul in the 2nd chapter of Philippians, and this is what Paul says. He says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made Himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Do you see the downward movement, always down from God, having the prerogative to stay God, but choosing to cast it aside, coming down, 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 becoming a man, not just any man, not just a king, not just a rich man, but a servant. Not just a servant, but a servant who was arrested, a servant who died. That's the downward movement. That's the meta-narrative that we learn from the gospel. So different from the meta-narrative that we learn from science. Science is about struggle. It's about that upward struggle. And in science, those of you who are from Africa know this so well. I've been there. I've seen the herds of animals. When one animal starts limping, the rest of the herd leaves it behind. Let the lions take care of it. We can't risk the herd for one weak animal. We've got to keep moving because it's survival of the fittest. It's the struggle that life consists of. So different from the gospel story where Jesus says, it's how you do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, that matters most. That's how the nations will be judged. Did you visit me in prison? Did you feed my hungry? Did you give water to the thirsty? That's how the nations will be judged. It goes against nature. And I guess that's really one of the things that first attracted me to Dr. Brand. As I mentioned to the students the other day, I'm a journalist. I've interviewed all sorts of people in my life. I have never met anyone both as bright and as wise as Dr. Brand. Every question I had ever had, I would bring to him, and he had already thought it through, had read the sources, and could give me a response to that question. So here's a man who could have stayed in University Hospital in London, could have had a research laboratory, could have done it, maybe won a Nobel Prize in medicine, but instead he understood this Philippians 2, and he went down, down, down. He served the lowest people on the planet, many of them in India of the untouchable caste background, and they had leprosy. I've met these patients, and I've heard their stories, how they were already at the bottom of the social caste ladder, and yet when the first signs of the disease appeared, they would be kicked out, often literally kicked with a shoe, out of their home, out of their village. But some of them heard, there's one man down near Vellore, a hospital, who will take your hands, take your feet, and try to remake them. And they would get on a bus and often be kicked out of the bus, and sometimes come for days and weeks walking, leaving a trail of blood with every footstep because they didn't feel the pain of the wounds of their feet. And here was Paul Rand and his wife Margaret, who devised similar procedures for their eye conditions. And they would devote months and sometimes years reshaping these outcasts of humanity. That was permanently imprinted on me as a living example of what Paul is talking about in Philippians 2. I was in Nepal a few years ago and visited some of the outgrowth of the work in leprosy, someone who had been trained by Dr. Brand. Nepal is a beautiful story of what you've been talking about in this conference. In 1950, there were 0 Christians in Nepal, Nepalese Christians, a few foreigners, of course. In 1951, there was 1 Christian. And the latest estimates I've heard, you can correct me, those of you from Nepal, the latest estimates I've heard is that there are 650,000 Christians in Nepal now, in just 60 years. How did that happen? Well, I've asked how that happened as a journalist, and again, they would tell me about the medical people who would come down, 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 and serve. And in so doing, they planted seeds of the kingdom. Jesus said, it's like the smallest seed in the garden. But when it falls into the ground, it will grow into a great bush, and the birds of the air will come and nest in it. And that's what is happening in Nepal right now. Not only did they talk about the medical treatment, they talked about the prayer. I've talked to many doctors in the United States, and every time when I was writing a book on prayer, I would say, have you ever seen a scientifically verifiable, supernatural, incontestable miracle as a result of your prayers? And most doctors in the U.S. would say, well, let's see. Yeah, there was this one woman, it was about 10 years ago, and they would tell me some story. But in Nepal, these were European skeptics, and every doctor I asked, have you ever seen a scientifically verifiable, supernatural, incontestable miracle? Oh yeah, all the time, and they would tell me story after story. And even the gentleman from Nepal, as I read his story in the notebook, came to Christ as a result of one of those prayers. People who were on the ground treating. Well, the people I met with were those who worked with leprosy. You don't see many miracles working with leprosy. I don't know of hands and fingers and feet that grow back once they've been amputated, once they've separated from the body. But I toured one of the hospitals there called the Green Pastures Hospital and met some of the leprosy patients. We were walking through the corridor, and as I looked in a little bit of a courtyard, there was a woman there who was one of the ugliest human beings I've ever seen. She had no toes, her feet were wrapped in bandages, she had no fingers left, they were all worn down, as Dr. Brandon discovered, because she couldn't feel pain. She had gone blind years before, her eyes were covered with crusty scales, her nose had shrunk, so that when you look at her, you can see right into her skull. Not a pretty sight at all. This woman was across the courtyard. She heard our voices, and she started crawling toward us. She couldn't really walk, so she would plant her elbows and then drag her body like an animal, like a wounded animal. And we just kind of noticed her, and then we went on for the tour. When we came back, she had dragged her body all the way across the courtyard and had somehow climbed up onto the sidewalk. And when I looked at this woman, I thought, it's a beggar, and I started digging around in my pocket to see if I had any Nepalese coins maybe to toss her. My wife is a social worker who worked with the down and out in the city of Chicago. She had much more holy reactions. She went over to her and put her arm around her. And at that moment, I snapped this picture that I brought of Don Maya. Not that one. Yes, there's my wife, and Don Maya, this shriveled little woman with no toes, with no fingers, with a nose that you could see right into her skull. And Janet leaned down, and she could hear her singing. She didn't know Nepali, but she didn't need to know Nepali. She knew the tune. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And the doctor who had been giving us the tour said, oh, I want you to be Don Maya. Don Maya is the closest thing to a saint we have here. She's a prayer warrior. If there's anything wrong with you, if there's anything you need prayer about, Don Maya is the one to go to. She's always at the door of the chapel. There aren't many Christians here. She's always at the door greeting everyone who comes in. And I thought, oh, how I've misjudged. And how often we misjudge on the externals the people that we are around. As I was writing the book on prayer, I decided that a lot of prayer is simple vision correction. To ask God to help me see the world in the way that God sees the world. Because the world sees her as this shriveled up, ugly beggar woman. And we're so tempted to take on the world's eyes. And instead, at that moment, I saw, this is a temple of the Holy Spirit. This is where God lives. This is not a collection of cells. This is a person made in the image of God. You, in the medical profession, have the opportunity to teach the rest of us something of God's eye, point of view. You know, there's a phrase that theologians have often used that the church usually doesn't get right, and that is, hate the sin, but love the sinner. Have you heard that phrase? Hate the sin, but love the sinner. And the church usually doesn't do it very well. You can teach us how to do that, because you have people who come to you who are quite irresponsible. They're overweight, they're alcoholics, they're chain smokers, and yet still you treat them You don't treat them because you love what they're doing to their bodies. In fact, you're trying to liberate them from what they're doing to their bodies, but you treat them because you care for them as persons, despite what they're doing to their bodies. To me, that's a beautiful example of hating the sin, but at the same time loving the sinner. I have a friend who, in medical school, heard a lecture from somebody called The Doctor, the Clergy, and the Prostitute. Think about that. The doctor, the clergy, and the prostitute. And in the lecture, the woman said that all three have something in common, that they all have the obligation to treat the individual above society, even to value the individual more than society. So you're in good company with clergy and prostitutes in what you do. As you do so, as you serve God by serving your neighbor, you too can sow the seeds of the kingdom. Jesus was very clear, as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. There's a beautiful footnote to the history of leprosy. In the Middle Ages in Europe, strange things were happening in the Middle Ages in Europe. And in the Middle Ages, somehow the rumor spread that when Jesus was on earth, he contracted leprosy. Now, there's nothing in the Gospels that would indicate that at all. But someone had read Isaiah 53, the only physical description of the Messiah that we know, and it said something like this, like he was one from whom we turn our faces. From whom we turn our faces. Someone who's hard to look at. So they read that and they thought, oh, Jesus must have had leprosy. Well, a movement sprang up. Up until that time, people with leprosy had been cast out, outside the camp. You would never have them in your village. You wouldn't want to be around them. They had to ring a bell when they approached, so you could go away from them. But now they thought, well, if Jesus had leprosy, then if we treat a person with leprosy as if we would treat Jesus, then we will have merit. Then Jesus will recognize that as an offering to himself. And so the original leprosariums formed in the Middle Ages in Europe. In fact, in France alone, there were 2,000 of these leprosy hospitals. They were called lazaretti, lazaretto, after the biblical man Lazarus, who supposedly had leprosy. And as I thought about that, as I read it, it occurred to me, oh my goodness, if only all of us could treat the poor, the needy, the sick, in the same way they treated leprosy. And if you read the history of leprosy, it wasn't always the best doctors, the best scientists, but almost all of the advances in both the understanding, the diagnosis, and the treatment of leprosy came from Christian missionaries. Why? Because they were the only ones who would touch. They were the only ones who would be with them. And even today, there's a leprosy mission and an American leprosy mission. I don't know of a tuberculosis mission, I don't know of a malaria mission, but there is a leprosy mission coming out of that insight that traces all the way back to the Middle Ages. I've seen the effect of that in Katagiri, India, where Dr. Brand practiced, where people come from all over the world to this place that began as an outcast place, and yet now it's a center of a thriving place of treatment where people come and learn and take those skills back to their own country. You welcomed the new chapter in Ethiopia. I saw something similar in Ethiopia earlier in this year. Some of you may know the story of Catherine Hamlin, the Australian missionary who, along with her husband, they were both in obstetrics and gynecology, and they came to Africa, and Ethiopia found a huge problem with the fistulas that developed with poor treatment in childbirth and prenatal care. And we visited the fistula hospital. Catherine Hamlin is still there. She's 86 years old. She practices surgery 1 day a week. She's in the operating room. And she lives in a little cottage. And we had been to some very sad parts of Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. This place is like an oasis of beauty. In fact, Catherine Hamlin, she only practices surgery 1 day a week. I think she works in her garden 6 days a week. And Janet noticed, my wife noticed these hydrangeas. She hadn't seen hydrangeas in Addis Ababa. She said, oh, I noticed your hydrangeas, how they're thriving. And Catherine, this Australian woman, said, oh, yes, yes, I looked around my garden and I decided it needed a little blue. It needed a little blue in the color spectrum. People told her that first no one would come, much like those with leprosy, people with fistulas, they smell, they're a disgrace, the family makes them live in little huts outside the village, they'll take them food maybe, but they're never allowed back in the house and they're never able to be married again. And then Catherine developed these procedures where she could go in and do surgeries in ways that restore, with great success, the fistulas, so that the women can go back, can get married. Those who can't, those that she can't heal completely, she usually hires as nurses. And as we went through, everyone said, you can't have white cloth, you can't have a ward that smells nice, but as we went through, everything was beautiful and white and clean and sterile, and there were no odors. And the nurses and the aides in the wards were former patients that Catherine had trained. As I looked around in that oasis of beauty in a very needy country, I realized yet again a seed of the kingdom had fallen in the ground, and a bush had grown, and today the birds of the air nest in it. A few years ago, one of Oprah Winfrey's one of the schedulers of her show had heard about Catherine Hamlin, so she flew her over from Ethiopia. They tell the story of Oprah looking at the days. What is this? Some woman talking about, we can't even talk about this on the air. We can't show charts or anything. Who booked this person? Very upset. And then Catherine came out and simply told the story of woman after woman who made their way, usually walking. They weren't allowed on public transportation because of the way they smelled. And eventually they came to her hospital and she reshaped their lives and sent them back. And meanwhile, behind the curtain on the Oprah Winfrey show, the people who work behind the show are digging in their purses and wallets, trying to come up with some money and crying. And Oprah herself was so deeply moved. Eventually she sent a camera crew over and did a movie about some of these women and donated a whole ward for the Fistula Hospital in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. You will hear again and again, you have heard again and again, the message of this world that you gain life by striving. It's that meta-narrative, very much like science. By rising, by climbing, by getting degrees, by getting money, by getting prestige, by getting material things. Jesus has a different way, the way of Philippians 2. That you gain life not by accumulating more and more, but by giving away, by denying yourself. You gain your life, oddly enough, by losing it, and in the very process of losing it, you find it. It's a deep irony. It's one of the truest things I've ever known. Jesus himself demonstrated that. He never wrote a book. He never attended university. He died at the age of 33. He was a prisoner. He was executed. And yet he changed history more than any human being who's ever lived. As a journalist, over the years, I've interviewed many kinds of people. As I look back on them, I tend to divide them into two categories. There's one category that I call stars. And these are the people that are usually on the covers of our magazines. And I've gotten to know them. They're the Uruguayan football team. They're the celebrities. They're the Hollywood actresses. They're the people that we want to be like. Oddly enough, as I've interviewed people like that, I don't really want to be like them. I go to their houses, I sleepy journalist that I am, I go to the bathroom, I look in their medicine cabinet, how many pills it takes them just to get through a day. Many times their marriage has failed, many times they're going to see a psychiatrist, which is good for your business, but it's something that you don't hear about, the celebrities, the stars. Many times those who are in the spotlight are striving for the spotlight because they have deep inferiority complexes that they're trying to overcome. And then there's another category that I call servants, and Dr. Paul Brand was the one who most impressed me with that. And they are people who could have all of this, but instead give it up and serve. Or they're linguists who go into some jungle and spend their life 30 years translating the Bible into the language of a tribe. There are only 400 people in the tribe. And as I've got to know those people, I used to feel sorry for them. Oh, those poor people, think of all that they could have and all that they gave up. And I must tell you as a journalist, as I look back, these are the ones I want to be like. These are the ones who form me. They have a gratitude, they have a fulfillment and a contentment with life that I have not found in the stars. Even though the stars are the ones we put on the covers of our magazines, the ones we think that we want to be like. I wrote 3 books with Dr. Paul Brand. 2 of them came about. We were just talking one day, and he said, oh, I tried writing a book once. I said, really, what happened? Oh, I don't know. Let me see. I think it's around here somewhere. And we finally found it in his bureau drawer full of socks. And underneath the socks, he found an old, remember the days of carbon paper? This is India paper. I think it was about the 5th copy on carbon paper. They typed 5 copies at a time. And it was all smudged. I could barely read it. And he hadn't touched it in 30 years. He said, I gave this as a series of chapel talks at the medical college in India, but I never got around to do anything with it. And I said, could I take this? And after several years, that smudged manuscript became 2 of my books with Dr. Brand, fearfully and wonderfully made and in his image. In the process of doing those books, I followed him around to India, to London, to other places, and I remember some of the patients that we met with, particularly one man named Sadan, who he writes about often. I went to Sadan's very humble home, and in that home he had a picture of Paul and Margaret Brand, and underneath it he had handwritten, may the Spirit of the God who lives in them live also in me. This was a man who had no fingers left, who had no toes left, who apart from them would have been a beggar on the streets. Instead he had a profession, instead he had pride, he had been remade as a person. May the Spirit of the God who lives in them live also in me. You will face a challenge all your life because our society keeps wanting to make you one of the stars. We want to pay you more. We want to interview you. We want to shine a spotlight on you. We want to give you awards. It will be very hard to remember Philippians 2. I read you the downward part, who being in the very nature of God didn't consider it something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, became a servant, died. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth. There's the ending. You give away your life, you deny, but in the very process of going down, you are exalted, you are raised up in the ways that matter most. Jim Elliot, one of the missionaries who was killed by what were then called the Alca Indians in Ecuador, said, we concentrate so much about God working through us. He said, I have concluded that God is less interested in what God can do through us as what God can do in us. That's what God cares most about, what God can do in you. It's easy to measure your effect on the patients. Maybe a deeper question is, what are your patients' effect on you? How do they change you? Because if you're treating persons rather than cells, conditions, they will affect you. They will change you. I stand here as one deeply affected by a man who did just that, Paul Brand, who lived his life for an audience of one. He got plenty of awards, recognition. He was usually embarrassed by them. One reason I was attracted to him is that almost everybody else I had interviewed wanted to look better. So if I would send them an article in advance, they would always try to color it in a way that made them look better. Dr. Brand always tried to make himself look worse. Oh, that wasn't my idea. That was Ernest Ritchie's idea. That was, oh no, you're giving me too much credit. He understood Philippians 2. I remember so well, I was on my way to New Zealand. We were to leave the next day. and I got a call in 2003 that Paul Brand had fallen. He had a brain hemorrhage and was in intensive care. So after working very hard to find a real person to talk to at United Airlines, I finally convinced them to change my flight and route it through Seattle early in the morning so that we could see Paul Brand one last time. His family had flown in. They were all gathered together. And here was this man who was more than a mentor. He was a father figure to me. My father died when I was a year old, so I never knew him. And he was like I had never seen before. I had spent so many hours with him, and now his head was shaven. There was a huge scar where they had done the surgery. His entire upper brain was no longer functioning. It was just his lower brain. And he couldn't respond at all. He was curled into a fetal position. Reached down and kissed that bald head, shaved head, and held his hand. And as I did so, an amazing thing happened. A man his body was being run entirely by his lower brain started examining my hand. He'd been a hand surgeon for 60 years. And the patterns were so deep that even though he had no consciousness, no upper brain consciousness at all, he's going over my hand, feeling the fingers, and making some sort of primitive diagnosis, probably. A few weeks later, we had a memorial service for him. There was an open microphone, and we were irritated at the time, but as I look back on it, it was a classic legacy to the Brands, because these rather unbalanced, uneducated patients kind of took over the microphone and went on and on. People had flown in, distinguished people had flown in from UK and from Australia and from India, and were prepared to make comments about Dr. Brand, and they never got to the microphone because these patients had taken over. And I thought, well, that's the way the Brands would like it. That's the way they would like it. A few of us were on the program, though, and I stood before them. I took my shoes off because he always appreciated going barefoot. And I said, we had a strange exchange, Paul Brand and I, because I met him at a time when my own faith was still up in the air. I wasn't sure where I would land. And in the process, I gave words to his faith. I wrote his story, but he gave faith to my words. What an incredible exchange. I had met many unhealthy Christians. I had met many wounding Christians. But you know what? You only have to meet one genuine, living follower of Christ to be convinced it's true. It's true. Paul Brand did that for me. Vicariously, I hope, in some way for you as well. May we all honor his memory in the way that he would want by giving glory to God, and committing ourselves to serving God and our neighbor through our profession. Amen.